Budget update and rock and roll.
Welcome to the February 27th, 2023 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. And with that, I open this meeting and we'll turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. So your first topic tonight is a high level update about the budget and really to set you up to have a discussion about a potential revenue team. You're going to have a lot more budget this week than you probably want because we have a almost full day Saturday discussion. So this is going to hit things at a really high level and hopefully leave you plenty of time just to have a conversation. So I'm joined by Twyla Miller, our finance director. I'm going to do the first few slides and then Twyla will take over. This slide I actually showed, I can't remember if it was the last budget or the one before, but I was kind of like, here we are at the beginning of the cycle, which is we propose the budget and then we go through all these different steps. This year is really different and we're actually starting sooner. So that was kind of the idea this weekend, today and this weekend, is to start preparing folks for what's going to be in the budget that I present on April 26th. So trying to consistently be as transparent as possible, as engaged as possible, and sharing information as soon as we can about things we see coming. The last couple of years, I guess I would say we've been working on kind of preparing for this budget. This is what happens like when I do slides, they look hand-drawn and a little bit messy. And this is what happens when actual professionals do slides. But as you know, we started last year really sort of diving into the priority-based budgeting process. So if we go back to January of 2022, we chose to go through this process, started inventorying everything we do across the city, and developed, I think, 204 separate program areas, which is before we used to kind of describe things in service areas, which I think we still do. I think there's like 54. So it really provided a lot of granular information about all the different things. Started understanding what we were assessing, went out and did a community survey, did an organizational assessment for you. All of this kind of prepare us for strategic planning, because we knew as we went into the second part of creating the priorities-based budget that we would need to understand how do things factor up against your priorities and things you're trying to achieve. When we talk about this on Saturday, you'll get a lot more about it. But I think where we are now as we're starting to build the budget is, you know, priority-based budgeting doesn't get us all the way there. And we're preparing for a pretty significant budget decrease in this biennium and probably a little bit in the next biennium. And so there's been a lot of conversations about, should we be creating a revenue team to be looking at some of these service areas that we've been doing more one-time and ad hoc that are actually becoming real services that we need to do on an ongoing basis. And as I see it, you sort of have two choices. One is we can talk about revenues and determine are there things out there we haven't considered? And the second is to have a more serious conversation about what our priority is going to be if that's not an option. So that's kind of the purpose of tonight. You're going to see this in a little bit of a different format on Saturday, but I'll just talk about what I think the two big problems are we're trying to solve this year anyway. The first is the gap, and that is the general fund gap, the bare minimum number that we need to reduce our ongoing revenues in order to stay in a healthy, even it could be weakened, but healthy financial position and not dip our reserves too low. So when we look at the biennium, that number for the general fund is really $12 million that needs to come down in the first year of the biennium and $3 million in the second year of the biennium. And then there's this whole conversation about things that we've been doing and these cross over into the urgent needs, but really around housing, work we're doing around affordable housing and the unhoused, a lot of the work we've been doing around downtown safety, downtown programming, work we've been doing around climate, work we're continuing to do around alternative response. And then there's that sort of adds up to about plus or minus in the biennium if we just do kind of I think a good investment that starts to really move the dial on that, probably another 5. So you're looking at about a $15 million reduction and a $5 million shift. That doesn't take into account all the one-time things. So the one-time investments we're making in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, our facilities reserve. There's a whole lot of things that we've been doing at the beginning of marginal beginning working capital that you wonder, like, shouldn't we be building these in? If we really have a sustainable financial picture, those would be things we wouldn't be depending on extras at the end of the year to fund. And so we're really thinking of that as being part of what's exciting about the biennium is it allows the budget committee to move out of the kind of, budget, supplemental budget, and it frees up a little bit of time where they can look at the financial policies. I know they have a desire to look at bylaws, and it allows time for you to think about a revenue team. Because we're in the biennium, we're trying to figure out as much as we can because it takes a while to get through those revenue conversations, but you may have an opportunity to influence the second year of the biennium and for sure the next one. When I think about urgent needs, I'm thinking about all of that. So the financial piece is certainly an urgent need, but I think we all know we also have a real big priority around the financial strategy and stability. Community trust and well-being for me is, those are the things we're hearing around, hey, we really need to see something change. We don't like the condition of the city, concern about the CSI and what happens to that when we come around for a vote on that. So that's just, to me, that seems urgent. And then I think our organizational trust and well-being too, especially as we go through a pretty significant cut where you'll see across departments, reductions at a time that we've been trying to go in the other direction, which is trying to right size workload and market and all of that. So all of those things are kind of urgent. And that's why I think the timing of discussion of a revenue team or services is front of mind for us. And I think the next slide is yours.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. So
extra.
Good evening, Mayor and Councilors. Twyla Miller, the Finance Director. So this slide here shows our typical funding process when we're considering a new revenue source. So we usually start up in that left quadrant at the top. We're identifying service delivery. And I always think of that as what problem are we trying to solve? So understanding what services, at what level, and what is the ongoing cost of those. So this first step is important because it influences the rest. So the next phase we go to is information gathering. And this is really done by staff where we take a look, knowing the issue that we're looking at. We take a look at what are other jurisdictions doing as far as revenues, how are they funding things. We look at our other local jurisdictions just to see generally what revenues are people considering on a general basis. And then also what ballot measures might be coming up. So are there bonds or levies coming up on the ballot? And then we also always look at our compression to understand where we are with our general government cap. Once we have that information, we actually go to the next phase, which is evaluation. And this is where the revenue team comes in, particularly when there's a larger problem. So in your packet, we had the reports from the last 3 revenue teams, but generally, this would be a team we would pull together. Staff meets with the team. We have a range of revenues we look at over time, and we sometimes add to them. But basically, we do a grounding with that team to look at criteria. So when we think about the problem we're trying to solve and the nexus to a revenue source, we're looking at things like how much revenue is generated every year, how stable is the revenue over time, what are the implementation and administration costs ongoing, and what's the complexity of a various source? And then always we're looking at what is the impact. So there's a range of impacts that we look at. So we're looking at what is the range on the, or what are the impacts on the business community? What are the impacts for our low income community? What are impacts for on the environment or other council goals? There's a whole range of things we look at. And it's important that we look at those to understand and put together a holistic picture. So generally we work with those teams, we kind of ground everyone in those, in the criteria and what all of the options are. And then we usually ask those teams to kind of refine, given all that they know, to kind of refine the choices to their top 2 or 3 revenues. And then staff takes a look at those, and we actually update those. We look at revenue yield in today's environment. We look at implementation and administration today. It might be something we haven't looked at before, or maybe we haven't looked at for some time and things change. So we look at all of those things and we provide information back to the team. And then that helps them as refine their work, and ultimately they make a recommendation to the city manager. And with that recommendation, then we move into selection, and that's where things come back to council. So work sessions are scheduled, we provide information, you have lots of time to ask questions and find out more. And then there's usually an engagement process with the community at some point along the way if things progress, and that can look at like different things. It can be a survey with the community. It can be selected or specific outreach to stakeholders if there are certain stakeholder groups that are impacted in the community. And it can also be, of course, people coming for public comment and public hearings to council. So then ultimately, this group as the policymaking body gives direction to move forward. Okay. So the revenue proposal we have to you today, before you today, is to develop ongoing funding strategies to support kind of two areas of services. So one would be climate and sustainability, and the other would be downtown and the unhoused work. And the outcome of the team would be a report to the city manager detailing the findings of the team and funding recommendations. And because of the nature of this project and the team, we actually are recommending a slightly broader team. Sometimes the revenue teams are just counselors or just counselors and budget committee members, but we recommend a broader look here where we have city councilors, budget committee members, community partners. So these could be from the business community, nonprofits, or other groups, other advisory group or commission members as needed. And of course, the team would have facilitation and support by city staff. As we've done in the past with some teams like this where they have a broader constituency, we recommend the team be formed as follows. So the mayor, of course, as she normally would work with counselors to see which counselors are interested in serving on the team. The city manager would work with the budget committee chair to see which budget committee members were interested in sitting on the team. And then the city manager would also develop a list of interested community partners and other advisory members that then we would bring back as a list to the mayor and the council president, and they would still ultimately select the team. That's worked well in the past when we've had broader groups in previous teams. So back to the budget development slide, in an ideal world, we'd have, if you choose to move forward with this idea, we would have a team kind of selected by early May. That would allow staff to schedule a range of meetings with the revenue team starting in June. So the idea would be we would have the revenue team do the work between June and October with the outcome of a recommendation to the city manager of a funding recommendation by the end of October. And then we would schedule some work sessions with council following that, hopefully before your winter break. You know, when you think about all of the pieces and heading into a biennium, and this is a large body of work, but it's achievable during this time. And it feels like it's, given the pieces that the city manager was talking about earlier, it would help define a path moving forward. And then finally, I just wanted to end kind of back to where what some of the things that the city manager was talking about a moment ago. So I really think of this as the first step in a process. So this next biennium is really finding stable funding for some of the urgent needs in our community while we stabilize our reserves so we're financially resilient at the same time. And then when we think about the future, we know our long-term financial planning doesn't include some critical needs for a sustainable service system. So this would be kind of right-sizing the service system, some unfunded infrastructure and equipment needs, modernizing our processes, and a range of other things. And then we always know there's always something new and different coming down the path. So making sure we're financially resilient so we can address those things as they come in the future. So it's really kind of the first step in probably a multi-step process. And with that, that's all we have today. I'll see if the city manager has anything else. Otherwise, we can open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. It really, I joked about how many pages there were in this packet, but actually it was very helpful to see the previous revenue committees and the process and the structure and kind of the nature of the research that they've done and where they landed. So I'm going to thank you for that. And And I'm recognizing that even though there's a lot that's unexpected in the future, there's a lot that is pretty consistent year after year. I mean, homelessness, housing, public safety. I mean, these are persistent concerns. So I really appreciate this effort and the push also by the budget committee to look at this again. So with that, are there counselors with comments, questions? Emily, okay, take it away.
Thank you. Great big project ahead of us. I really like that the team is expanded to include a bigger variety of people. Jennifer and I were on the payroll tax committee. It was really fascinating. I learned a lot, which of course I still know. I think this will just be really good for the city, and I appreciate the outreach of it. I think it's going to be good. Thank you.
Okay, who's got a question or a comment? Alan.
Yeah, I think this is a timely thing to do. Obviously, I put out a work session poll a couple of months ago about this topic. I like the expanded group as well. I think that'll work well. I like the 3 areas of unhoused services, climate work, and downtown resilience. But I guess an important part of a group's work is that they have a clear charge. And so understanding what does it mean to have to fund more unhoused services, more climate work, and downtown resilience work. How are we going to identify what that body of work is, identify the need around that, and cost it out? Because neither the housing services or the climate change work, and for that matter, the new downtown resilience work, they have ideas, but they don't have things fleshed out that allow us to then cost them out to be able to figure out how much we need. So how are we going to approach that aspect of it and figure out what the need is?
Sure. Okay.
So you will learn more about the future. So when we think about stepping into the biennium, as the city manager mentioned, we've been funding some of these things on a one-time basis or cobbling together funds, or we have some ongoing funding here and there for some of these efforts. So as part of the 23-25 biennial proposal, part of the proposal will be identifying an ongoing service need for each of those areas in her proposal. So I think I would say probably stay tuned. You'll get more information this weekend, and as part of the proposed budget, which will help define what those areas might look like on an ongoing basis as we look to the future.
Let me be a little bit more specific. So when we did the road bond, we said, what are the projects? How much do they cost? And which ones are going to fund them? We wrote them down, and we did all of those, and we couldn't deviate from that list. And we knew all the cost of them. We knew what they were, and we planned that out over the 5-year period. We don't have that level of detail for any of these 3 services. So are we going to go after it like, well, we need about X amount of dollars in each of these areas, or are we going to approach it from a project specific basis?
I think we actually do have some of those numbers. So we know, and I won't be able to spit it off the top of my head right now, but we know, what we're spending right now around some of the day-to-day activities around servicing the unhoused. We know what we're spending on the rest stops and safe sleep sites. So we know sort of like here's the range of services that the city has been picking up, either through one-time dollars, ARPA dollars. And if you want to keep those things going, it's going to cost this amount of money, or we are going to have to stop doing these things and somebody else is going to have to start. So it's kind of, or we have to stop doing something else, right? So we'll have that number. I think we'll have a good sense around the downtown number. That's if these are the right areas, right? And I think we picked these because they're the things that we keep having to we're making reductions in other places to fund these because they seem pretty mission critical to the community. Climate is one that I don't feel as strongly that we have a really clear, we know what we might need in terms of staffing, but I don't know, beyond that, if it's other capital dollars, we don't have that. So we should be able, within those service areas, we should be able to define a number.
Yeah, in the climate area specifically, there's one of the things you could do in this space is to create incentives for people to act, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we can create that project list based on the CAP 2.0 stuff. The other aspect of that is from an incentive perspective, there's a lot of money coming from the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill that are coming at us kind of slowly, but surely over the next year. Maybe some of them will be really highly defined by the time this group gets together. So I would hope that that part would also be embedded in this conversation so we can have a broader perspective and picture about, on the climate side, what we are able to do, what we're able to incentivize and move forward.
Good, thank you. Matt, you ready?
Yeah, I think so.
And then Mike.
I recognizing the constitutional home rule, and the powers that the Eugene City Charter grants, I am fascinated by the creation of this committee, as outlined in our AIS. I am fascinated by the work that's already been done, and not reinventing the wheel, but perhaps sharpening our pencil around some of the ideas and pathways that already exist, including but not limited to a heavy vehicle tax, luxury tax or consumption fee, parking tax, a tax on consumers for use of certain utilities to help us reach our goals under the climate and sustainability bucket and the bucket, the downtown and unhoused bucket. I would ask about some specificity around the around, it's not necessarily our lane. It's our county partners' lane in regards to housing or health and human services. And the problem is framed as downtown, but our unhoused challenges go well beyond the downtown borders. How broad in scope are community members, budget committee members, and council going to be looking at that downtown / unhoused bucket? Is that are we proposing a citywide solution? Are we proposing a downtown only solution?
So in previous budgets, we've had the downtown program, which has been things like the ambassadors, programming downtown, some of those cleaning. There's been some facility improvements and infrastructure improvements like lighting and things downtown. We think of that as kind of our downtown program, downtown safety. We're suggesting that that programming be considered along with the unhoused, which is a separate program. So with the city. So we've put those together thinking there's kind of two tracks that we would look at. One would be the climate sustainability work. The second would be kind of downtown unhoused. There might be some tangential impacts between the two, but it's not meant to suggest that it's just unhoused in the downtown area, but it would be unhoused, the unhoused program in the city. And so
They definitely overlap.
Mhm.
So the climate sustainable strategies are throughout the municipality, and the tackling the unhoused challenges is a little more narrow in scope.
No, I think that's across the community.
Yes.
I mean, we'd be looking at what are the services that we're providing today that we don't have funding to do in any sort of ongoing way, or the things that we're going to do this year that we're doing because we are reallocating resources from other places, which again, you'll learn more about later this week twice, because I meet with you on Wednesday.
So I'm still, just forgive me for just being so upfront about my longing for, I'm longing for some clarity of when I see downtown / unhoused. I recognize that housing and public safety rise to the top of every poll.
Yep.
And I don't know where downtown rises in those polls. But it's being framed as downtown / unhoused. And yet it's broader than that, but it's still being framed as downtown / unhoused. I'm confused. Apologies for.
It's okay. I totally understand that. So this is why the first piece of pie is which services, what levels needed, and what's the estimated cost. Like we're just suggesting that this is a jump off point because it's the areas where we've been spending a lot of funding. So we could have listed them each separate. So for me, the downtown piece and the reason why it rises up is because when you get the community survey work around people's feelings about safety, cleanliness, all of those things, they tend to, a lot of it focuses on downtown, especially as you looked at the downtown area. The downtown work session you did a couple of weeks ago where you looked at like, where were people concerned? And it's because a lot of people are coming downtown to work and do things, and it's an issue that we don't have funding for at a higher level of service. So if you want a different level of service, we need to talk about how we're going to do that. It's either some additional revenue or it's a reallocation of money from other city services to do that. We can talk more about this on Wednesday too.
But they're two separate things. Downtown, almost as in climate, they're three separate areas.
Yeah.
Right, and yet but it's framed as kind of these two, identify, evaluate, develop revenue funding strategies to support services for bullet point 1, climate sustainability, bullet point 2, downtown / unhoused. Anyway, it's.
Yeah, well, we'll be discussing this on
Should have added a
Saturday.
bullet point.
Yeah, but if you look at Sarah's drawing, they're separate. So
And if you look at this,
breakout, so
separate.
it's separate. So, but I think it sounds like we're jumping off here. We haven't defined totally. Okay, Mike and then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm in a similar place as my last two colleagues. I'm not sure I understand, although the manager just clarified a bit there for me, why these three subjects are first considered. It sounded like you said these are places where we currently have funding to do the service level we're doing in some of these areas, but in the near to be future, we may not. And so to maintain service level, it sounds like we want to make sure that we have adequate revenue to do that. I'm wondering, just first off my head, what level of service are we paying for with regard to climate work that we won't be able to pay for in the near future?
So I'll just say this, the purpose of giving you some ideas as a jump off point was these seem to be areas of concern for a lot of folks that we're doing one time. It could be that the council says, you know what, we actually don't want to do any of those. We want to actually focus on this whole other area of city services. So it was just a jump off point for you to push back on. I think the climate piece, we have incrementally added staffing every year to try to address the work and the workload that comes with that. And if you want to achieve greater things, like some of the things Councilor Zelenka was talking about, an investment fund or a way to incent people to do whatever, we just don't have a way to fund that. So if you want to have a conversation about that, then we're just saying that could be an area that you evaluate and determine, do we want to increase our service area here and or not?
How much of it is CFAC compliance?
That's a whole nother body of work. But there's a lot there. I mean, planning services would be easily something you could add into that bucket.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there are other priorities I would choose as investments in our community long term. Maybe I'd probably choose a lot of this as well, but there would be others that I would put up there. We've already done that with public safety. I think we've made a good start there. I would think that housing is separate from homelessness in the sense of how the city approaches it. And that's another area where, seeing new homes properly incentivized to come out of the ground and get built for people. I think we've created some disincentives lately, and we have quite a bit of work to do to get back to an advised place with incentivizing seeing new homes be constructed or new housing. And certainly we can use all the tools we can come up with financially and otherwise. So can you tell me about the mechanism we're going to use to make more narrowing decisions with which areas need funding? Because your model seemed to indicate it was look at the need first.
Right. And if I could also add, when we think about these areas and we think about our service system over time, so these are 3 areas that are priority for our community where we've added services, but we haven't had ongoing revenue to support the service need. And it made sense, right? As we've gone through the years, we've used one-time funding, we've had ARPA, we've had grants, we've had other things to understand, what we can provide. And through community survey and other things, it's been very clear that some of these areas are very important to the community. So
Forgive me for interrupting you. I apologize. I think there are other areas that the community has identified that aren't captured here or that rise above some of these areas. I'm wondering, how is it that council gets to have final say on that?
Yes.
Because you do. So I think, that if you want that first, a couple of things, you could agree to have another work session and talk about, let's define the service areas before we even put this budget committee together. You could do that. Or you could say, let's put the revenue committee together, have them evaluate all the different things and come up with a set of recommendations. And then you can kind of up or down that. It's really up to you. We're trying to just bring forward a process to help you get there.
Right. And I appreciate that. That's why I was asking the process question. And I like your last suggestion of having a multitude of inputs about the range on which we might have that work done and which issues are focused on first, and let the council talk about that as an interim step. My point of view. Thank you.
Okay, Randy and then Jennifer.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Twyla, for the presentation. This is a good body of work. I'm still a little sketchy on some of the details, but I'm sure you are as well as we kind of go through this process, not knowing exactly what the state or the federal government's going to do, if anything, to help us. But I know we can't count on that. I also see this process as really a short-term set of solutions, and then also thinking for the long-term piece of how do we promote economic development? How do we do things that create jobs that help with housing? The other half of affordable housing is living wage jobs, and we've lost so much of our manufacturing community. I think longer term, we need to be looking at that and and defining what our role is in helping that come in. The other thing I wanted to say, the downtown doesn't include any of my council ward, but it doesn't matter. The downtown is incredibly important to this community. It's our civic heart. And the downtown has had unique challenges. And sure, we've had challenges with our unhoused population. We've had challenges with crime that's not necessarily tied completely to the unhoused population. And it exists across our city. But downtown has been, in my opinion, a little more pronounced and a little more problematic. And we've seen businesses leave. And at a time when we're trying to bring more vitality and activity into downtown, we need to be thinking about that. And so I would appeal to my colleagues to, let's look at the whole community, but downtown is its own animal. And we kind of need to take that piece somewhat separately, because what is going to work downtown may not be the best strategy and tactics for some of the other areas like my ward. So I'll be interested in seeing that come out. The other thing I wanted to say is I've heard a number of people talk about the revenue committee and talking about things we aren't doing yet and maybe funding those. And I think that's fine and good, but before we do anything, we need to be figuring out how we close the budget gap. That's the here, the now. That is the challenge in front of us. And then the last thing I wanted to say as far as comments go, I'm always going to be a little leery when I hear new taxes. And I realize that's something that's part of the revenue discussion, but people out there are feeling taxed to their eyebrows on this. And, you know, I've watched how our compression level has shrunk, and I see I'm running out of time. But I think we need to be very cautious about how we proceed with that and, you know, make sure that we've looked at every other opportunity first. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I want to thank you for bringing up ideas. I know that's not always easy with our group, and we ask you to be more forthcoming with your recommendations. And so thank you for doing that and getting the ball rolling. These recommendations make a lot of sense to me for the same reason you're explaining. Like, these are areas we struggle to find funding for, and they're those high priority areas that we're constantly talking about, right? And if we can get some funding in these areas that is more stable and secure, you know, that gives us the ability to look for ways to fund those other things that through general funding dollars or some other way, right? It kind of gets some of the problem off our plate in a way. Although I do remember when we were on that revenue committee and how surprised I was at how many options were just not going to get us the money we needed. They sound great, but then you look at how much you're going to make and it's not even worth doing after the administrative costs and the fact that you're asking people to pay an extra tax when you're not even getting something that's going to solve your problem. So I really like this list, but I feel like chances are it's going to get smaller and smaller about what we're actually going to be able to fund once we start looking at those options. So starting with a huge list doesn't make sense to me. It makes a lot more sense for us to kind of really hone in on a few things that really need funding in the long term, and then do our best to concentrate our efforts there. I'm looking forward to more discussion on this, but I think we've set up really well to go forward and continue this conversation. So thank you, and thank you for the giant packet. More, it is actually nice, even though it's hard.
Thank you. Okay, I have Alan and Mike for second rounds.
Yeah, to me, this isn't baked enough to actually move on. And maybe we can get there today, but I'm not sure. Paying off what Mike said, I liked what he said. To me, if there were 4 steps that we were going to go through, which was form the committee, then have the committee investigate and make a recommendation to the council on the areas, so that this group then has a very clear charge. What specifically are we funding, and how much are we needed to do? How much is needed to do that? Those 2 are the critical questions. We don't have those yet. And if we can have the committee help us get there, make a recommendation to the council and have the council decide that, then the next step would be to then discuss the types of revenue choices that we have. And Jennifer, you're absolutely right. When you really come down to it, there's this big laundry list. When you get down to the ones that actually can do and make enough difference, it's really a handful or less that really make it. And to do a whole bunch of little things doesn't actually make sense because it's too expensive. And then have that conversation, have the recommendation come out of the committee, and then bring that back to council for final decision about what to do. That kind of process I could live with, because that makes sense to me. And getting that input from the committee makes sense to me. I like what Mike said about that. That made sense. So if that's the proposal, we can move forward.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand that. So you think it's premature to moving forward on a revenue committee?
No.
That was the motion today, or
No, the process. So the motion is to build a revenue team on attachment A.
Right.
Attachment A is has self-contradictory things in the first paragraph bullets. It says it identifies downtown resilience, comma, unhoused services, comma, and climate work. And then later it says 2 focus areas, downtown unhoused, climate sustainability. That's confusion. And the slides were confusing as well to me. So, and then exactly how that plays out isn't defined enough. So if we were to figure out how to form a committee, get the membership down, figure out that it's supposed to then look at the different areas of funding that we need with staff's help, come to the council with a recommendation that is clear about exactly what we need to fund, what we're trying to fund with this, and how much we need. Then we can, and then the council can decide yes, no on that. And then we can go back to the committee and say, okay, what are the different options? Look at those, make a recommendation, bring that back to council. And then we can make a final decision, yes or no.
So what I'm hearing from all that is move forward with getting the committee together as we've talked about, and you just want another meeting for that committee to say, here's actually the service areas and levels we recommend that we evaluate, and you say yes, and then they come back with the revenue.
Well, I think it's actually that discussion is a lot more than one meeting. I think there's a lot of staff work that needs to go into figuring that
Right,
out.
one meeting with the council is what I was imagining.
Oh, maybe. Depends what the committee comes up with. But yeah, they figuring out what it is that we're trying to fund and how much we need. Kind of the, that's this, how do we get there? How do we get to that point where we're specific enough? And then we can actually then figure out what revenue sources to go after and whether or not we should.
Okay. Okay, I think I tracked that. Looks like Sarah does. Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree wholeheartedly with what Alan just said. Also, I know it's very strange for me to repeat myself, but there's a strong possibility that anytime we talk about the Revenue Committee, I may do that in this case. But I certainly hope voluntary, keyword, voluntary annexation plan is a big part of anything we talk about with new revenue. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Lindsay.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand what Councilor Zelenka is saying about having more input, but I think that's what the Revenue Committee is designed to do. Maybe you need more of an outline, and but I'm ready to move forward with developing the committee for them to kind of break that down for us more and bring it back at a later time to council so that we can see kind of more detail. And as you have said, we are going to be learning a lot more throughout the next week, 2 weeks, and into April. So I think we should move forward with the committee and then have that additional time with more detail.
Okay, thank you. Emily?
Thank you. I'm concerned that we're making this into an even bigger project if we take on all the subjects that we need money for in the city. It's quite a bit, but as Alan has promoted in the past, climate and our homeless are 2 really big areas we need help with. Our homeless efforts, the funding we've had, ARPA and other things are going to stop. So that's going to be really critical. Where all this work we did, the infrastructure, if we can't keep funding it, it's going to be a really bad situation. And then the climate, we haven't had a lot of money or much, we have some staff to put into it. And yet we've said that it's really critical to the city. We have this ordinance and this plan and we're behind. And part of it is because we don't have any money to get it going. So, and then housing connected to homelessness, we want to promote that also. But we can't fund everything. We can't look for revenue for all of these subjects. And I feel if we're going to go back and look at all of the subjects in the budget and then pick out some that we think we can get revenue for, it's going to be much longer than 4 months. And it's a lot of work to go through all those revenue ideas, and most of them won't work. So maybe we don't need to, but I'm just concerned that it's becoming a global project instead of something that was a chunk.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other comments? Anyone needing another round? So, I agree. I appreciate that comment, Emily, because I think that we do know that we have sort of specific areas, and making it too global seems like a longer project. But we're going to hear more on Saturday. We're going to have an opportunity to refine our thinking and see where we're going, and a broader discussion with the larger budget committee. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, helping us sort of define this more broadly or more specifically. But we do have a motion put on the table around at least moving forward to create a revenue team. So I'm going to turn to Council President.
Thank you, Mayor. May I ask one question?
Please.
So just to confirm, something is going to come back to us if we establish this team here in a minute, that's going to talk a little bit more about how they are going to proceed with the work, taking into account what Councilor Zelenka said.
I'm thinking that, I mean, we have some time here. So while you're considering who should really be on it,
okay,
we can spend some more time thinking about that, first set of meetings where how we would present that. What I'm hearing is you want them to spend that time, staff to do that research, and then we come back to you with, this is sort of the service set that we're at the right level. And then you're basically just asking for a checkpoint along the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just think it's important to have a little bit of clarification as we go. And I recognize that at some point we have to step off with complete clarity, and that without having complete clarity, and that's okay, because we need to get moving on this. But at the same time, I'd like to know when we think we might hear a little more clarity.
Well, and counselors will be serving on this committee. So the door is open for people who are concerned about this process to be part of this revenue team. So you can have more control over that conversation if you want. Alan, one more comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're going to put forward as a motion, Randy. If it's attachment A, there's a lot of confusion in this from my perspective. If the motion were to form a revenue committee along these lines, but then have a more detailed proposal about how it's going to play out, come back to council, I think that might actually put us on a path towards figuring this out with a little bit more clarity. Right now, this isn't enough clarity just to go off and do good, kind of.
I agree, but I'm nervous about cobbling together a motion.
Yeah.
Is that something, excuse me, procedurally, am I okay?
Yeah, fine, go for it.
With that said, and I agree with what you said, Councilor Zelenka, but how are we going to craft the motion so it meets all that? I just don't want to start blurting something out here and end up with a camel when we're trying to build a horse.
I feel like it could be, I mean, if I feel like we're hearing you and we're all sort of on the same page. So if you want the motion to say, it could say, as generally outlined in attachment A, with a check in with council after committee has met first couple of times to talk about, I mean, I don't want to make it too long. I don't feel like we're in disagreement. I'm also thinking through, if you want us to revise this to add that point in, you could adopt this on Monday night. You're going to have a long Monday night, but we could just add it in as part of like consent or another item. It'll just be a long Monday night.
It would be Monday, the 13th.
Yeah.
So is that, I'm looking to you, Alan, in particular, because.
Well, right now, this is too unclear for me. I'm a no vote.
I think we're just, that's what we're saying. It's like,
Yeah.
You could just say, approve to form the committee and come back with additional detail about what,
How it's going to work.
Yeah.
How about this as a?
That's a simple.
How about that? Did you? Yeah.
You guys write it up, put it in consent calendar, and then if we
No.
still have a problem, we could pull it.
I think we can do this now. I think Sarah just offered some general language.
I wrote it down.
re-offer that.
So it would just be move to form the revenue team
Mhm.
and return with additional process and detail.
Okay.
Violin.
Violin.
Oh,
Violins on television?
I think, I think you need to give us a little bit of flex there because we have to form the group,
Right.
get them together. So by your summer break,
Well,
Or you could tie it to the
I'm-
meetings of the revenue.
I'm
committee.
thinking about the process stuff before you form it.
So,
Like, how is it gonna work?
so.
Me
How
too.
is it gonna work?
So my understanding from your timeline was that you wanted this committee to start meeting in June.
Yes.
So that means the committee can't come back to you before sometime in late June to talk about how they're going to function, right? So
Why would the committee decide how they're gonna function?
I thought that I thought your request was to form the committee and then have the committee report back to you on some of how they were going to proceed.
yeah.
And
That's a-
we're talking about having the committee identified by May to start meeting in June.
Can I clarify?
Yes, please.
So that wasn't what I
Okay.
meant to say, if that's what you got.
Me either.
What I meant to say was, you form the committee, we decide how it's gonna work and approve that. Before it meets in June,
Ah,
what's its charge and how's it gonna go through that process, including how is it gonna go through the areas and should it go through everything? Or should it, my work session poll was just on housing and climate, homelessness and climate. So that clarity around what the committee is going to do and how the process is going to work, I think is a short-term thing. You can start working on the committee. But I think we need to be clear about how it's going to work and how it's going to be put together and what the process is. And not just, I've been on committees that worked really well. They had really good charges. It's very clear. And committees that didn't work well, it was mushy. And they didn't know what to do. They floundered around. Everybody argued about what we were supposed to be doing. I don't want to put this committee in that circumstance. So the clearer we can be about what we want out of the committee, I think the better served we will be and the community will be.
okay. Okay.
So I'll say just a couple of things. Partly because what I fear, part of what we're hoping to do is as we start getting into the budget development, you're going to start feeling more pressure of, we should have started this 2 years ago, right? There'll be a little bit of that. And so I think one option is, we form the committee and it'd be nice to be able to say, we generally think these are going to be the focus areas and we're generally going to want to have you help us determine the right services and the right level. However, if what you're also saying is, but council's actually going to talk more about that before it's just a little bit not exactly how we've imagined it, but we can do that. I think it'll be hard to get the right revenue team members if we haven't sort of decided that we're generally going to look at these areas. So.
Yeah.
I have no idea what this committee is going to do.
So, it doesn't seem that, I just want just a point of clarification. So when we meet on Saturday, we're going to walk through a lot of pieces here. Do you envision that when we get through that meeting
Thanks.
when we get through that meeting, that we might be in a better place to distill down some of this revenue more precisely? I'm just thinking, is there an interim where we might not have exactly to the letter what you're asking for, really like a road bond, but we when the community safety payroll tax met, you had a sense of where you're going, but you didn't know specifically what it was going to pay for before you started meeting.
Yeah.
But it was public safety, community safety.
Right, and this would
This
be,
is,
I'm just trying to figure out about the pace and how.
I think what we were imagining is that we're involving a broad group of people to help us determine like what is the right scope, scale, issue, level. And so you're involving people from the very beginning in that conversation. I think what you're going to see is we're we're gonna be $15 million short, period. So even if we didn't do any work, any additional work on the unhoused, any of the one-time stuff, any of the downtowns, if we didn't do any of that, we're still looking at reducing city services. And then we're still trying to get those other things done. So there's another $5 million that's built in, that's repurposing funds. So we're taking funds from other services to make impacts here. So I think there's a bigger conversation that needs to happen to narrow it down, and we're gonna get pressure. You're gonna end up in a time pressure. So what we're trying to do is just start to let that pressure off by bringing community members together to talk about, here's the problem we're trying to solve. You eventually have to say, this is the right level and what it is, but I think it's going to be hard to narrow it without a little bit broader perspective in the room. But that's my perspective, and I feel like we're saying the same thing, and it's just.
So I wasn't asking that you narrow that down in the next week. I was asking, how are you going to get there? And so I don't know how you're going to get there. Just throwing a bunch of people into a room and having them talk about things that are important to them, coming up with a recommendation.
What I can also add is, so as part of the city manager's budget proposal, there are strategies for each of these areas as we move into the new biennium that in some ways look different than what they are at the moment. So I think on Saturday, we'll have a better idea of what is the vision for these service areas as we step into the next biennium. And so then I think the question is, does that, as we think about short-term, long-term, and think about revenues, does that look like the right problem to solve for? Or do we want to think slightly differently, either larger or smaller? But I think after Saturday, you'll have a better sense of what we will be bringing forward as we try to stabilize into the first biennium we're entering into. I think that might help with some of these questions around what is the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. I have both Emily and Matt in the queue. Emily, do you want to?
Thank you. When the Parks Committee that's in here worked, they were working on money for parks. I don't remember how detailed the plan was of what they were trying to find funding for. When we did the payroll tax, I think it was two separate teams, because I remember working on what the police needed and some idea of which direction they were going, which with homeless, we have that pretty well figured out because we need to keep going and maybe need to make a little more progress on climate, except we do have an action plan. So in both of those situations, we did not take on the whole city and all of the areas that need money. And I think this is similar because we've said for a long time, Councilor Zelenka, thank you, that we needed money for homeless and climate. So although, yes, I would like to find funding to make everything better, take care of the gap and do more, at this point, I don't think that's reasonable. So I get it, but I think in this situation, we need to be more focused. Thank you.
Okay, and Matt?
Thanks, Mayor. I just want to make an observation that I have a suggestion that I think might satisfy some of the consternation. I would want to go into this, forgive the term, it's guns blazing, looking at transient lodging tax, looking at a soda tax, looking at a service fee or Ticketmaster to generate revenue to help combat climate change or help alleviate or ameliorate houselessness in our community. What I appreciate are the guardrails in regards to, not guardrails, but I recognize there's a lack of specificity, but I appreciate the thinking about here are the buckets that we're trying to affect. And I think we could use some more significantly more specificity around those holes that we're trying to fill. That comes with the forming and storming and norming of the group. And I recognize there's, as I spilled coffee, I recognize that there's issues that even, thank you, Mayor, that I've referenced in that attachment A versus what we saw in the in the presentation, but here's a suggested motion that might help get us where we need to be tonight. If council president would consider this, it would be a motion to move to form the revenue team as described in attachment A, with council oversight and staff input regarding the process and specific charge of the committee. Is that
What is that?
more palatable?
Says form the committee as opposed to, so.
Yeah. Oh, how do you do the last part?
We indicate
By
that
what?
council has oversight, so staff would come back to council for us to approve. And we outline that we're embracing and requesting staff input about process and charge.
I think at this point, it feels like it would be good for us to come back with a different proposal for you and you can have it on your Monday night agenda or something. Is it doing it on the fly is raising other issues, and
Agreed.
okay.
Mike has his hand up.
Okay, and that was your suggestion to begin with, so we're
That
back.
was my suggestion.
There you go.
Yeah.
Mike has his hand.
There we go. Never should have shut you down.
Thanks.
Mike, are you okay if we just, or do you need to make one more comment?
If it's coming back to us with greater detail on process, I'm good. We come back.
Okay, all right,
On the 13th, it'll be right around the corner.
on the 13th. Yep.
Sounds good to
Okay.
me.
All right, so thank you all. That was a lot of discussion and thank you. And with that, we are ready to turn it to the city attorney to
Now you can sit down.
discuss.
Okay, I'll stay here.
HB 3115.
They hear.
All right.
Okay.
All right, I'll launch. This is intended to be just a short introduction. I know we'll be jumping in with both feet on the 8th. And so I just thought it would be a nice opportunity to have a short discussion about this. So I have about 10 minutes and then a couple questions, or if you have some specific things that you're hoping to make sure we talk about on the 8th, I want to give you an opportunity to raise those. And of course, you can always reach out to me separately as well. So what I'm going to be introducing to you today is what you'll be talking about on March 8th when it comes to House Bill 3115. And really it will be a focus on changes to the city's prohibited camping code provisions, with the ultimate goal that any changes would need to be in place by July 1st, which means we're shooting for an April 17th public hearing date for an ordinance, and then action ultimately by you in May at some point, maybe with a couple meetings within May before you take action, but May action. So very quickly, I'll just touch on the two cases that kind of are the cornerstones of the House Bill 3115. The first being the Ninth Circuit's case, 2018 case, Martin versus Boise. And that is the case that's most often spoken about when we talk about government's prohibited camping regulations. And while that case is talked about generally in prohibited camping, really that case was about government regulation of sitting, sleeping, or lying. And the holding in Martin from the Ninth Circuit was that municipal ordinances that criminalize sleeping, sitting, or lying in all public places when no alternative sleeping place is available violates the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And the Eighth Amendment being the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So that is the significantly narrow scope of Martin, and Martin, that court came out and said, this is a narrow holding, and this is what it has to do with criminalizing sleeping, sitting, and lying when no other alternative is available. So now we have the more recent decision of Johnson versus Grants Pass that was decided within this last year, also by the Ninth Circuit, and it is a restatement by the Ninth Circuit and a small expansion of what they held in Martin. And when they were restating the conclusion, they restated it similarly, saying Martin is about that it is unconstitutional to punish sleeping somewhere in public if one has nowhere to go. And they also stated, oh, that was narrow, and our decision here is also narrow, but we are going to expand on Martin. And here is how they said they were expanding on Martin, that sleeping in the context of Martin includes sleeping with rudimentary forms of protection from the elements, and that the decision in Martin applies to civil citations, whereas in the case of the grants pass regulations, the civil and the criminal punishments are so closely entwined. So that was how Johnson described their expansion upon their prior decision in Martin, again stating that it's still narrow. And that only matters for the context. What we're here to talk about is House Bill 3115. Those cases matter because it's often been stated that 3115 is simply a codification of Boise and Johnson. But really, those cases matter for the context, but we have the statutory obligations that we're going to comply with. So some of the reasoning of the courts and the underlying basis of the courts are interesting, but what we need to focus on is actually a one-page bill from the Oregon legislature that we need to be in compliance with by July 1st. So while it's been described generally that that House Bill 3115 is a codification of those two cases, there are some nuances within 3115 that aren't in those cases. The first being that the House Bill 3115 adds an objectively reasonable standard that doesn't exist that's not discussed in the cases. And also it creates a specific cause of action for a person experiencing homelessness to challenge the reasonableness of a city regulation, and allows a court to award successful plaintiffs attorney's fees. So those are nuances to the House bill that are not discussed or at issue with the two cases. So what does House Bill 3115 require of the city? You have the bill, it's attachment A to your AIS. It's a short one. It's only a page, but so I can summarize generally what it does fairly simply. It states that any city or county law that regulates the act of sitting, sleeping, or lying, or keeping warm and dry outdoors on public property that is open to the public must be objectively reasonable as to time, place, and manner with regards to person experiencing homelessness. The bill also defines what keeping warm and dry means. And they say that it's the using measures necessary for an individual to survive outdoors given the environmental conditions, but it does not include anything involving flame or fire. So that's the parameters of what we're working with. So as I mentioned in the AIS, the city has never regulated sitting, sleeping, and lying. We don't have any regulations now. We've never had any regulations that when it comes to the act of sitting, sleeping, or lying. We do have a regulation that prohibits camping on all public property. And that you'll find at Eugene Code 4.815, and that's our prohibited camping provision. And when it comes to the prohibited camping, the way it's organized is we define what a campsite is. And the manner of defining campsite is it is a establishment of a temporary place to live where there is bedding, sleeping bags, or other materials, regardless of whether there's a tent or some other structure. So with our definition, you have a focus on bedding and sleeping materials, and yet prohibited camping does not prohibit the act of sleeping. That could use some fixing. So we could define, we could clarify, we could make that far clearer. So on the 8th, you will have an opportunity to talk about some proposed amendments to that definition to true all of that up, make it more understandable, and make it fit better into what really is being regulated, which is not sleeping. So once we have a clarified definition for campsite, we still need to align our prohibited camping provision more closely with House Bill 3115 for the requirements regarding keeping warm and dry on public property that's open to the public, that's objectively reasonable, time, place, and manner regulations. And so the city's blanket prohibition on camping on any public property should be refined and aligned more closely with House Bill 3115. There's a lot of time, place, and manner camping related regulations that other cities have out there that we could look to for examples. And I'll include some of those in your in your AIS for March 8th, but every city is unique when it comes to this topic. And cities are unique based on their unhoused population, and cities are also unique in what they offer to their community, what permitted sleeping programs and options are available with a community. So knowing that uniqueness, on March 8th, you'll also have an opportunity to consider and talk about some reasonable time, place, and manner regulations that are intended to address specific safety issues, accessibility issues, and other issues that have risen to the top of being especially problematic within Eugene, and they are unique to Eugene. So I'll give you an example of what that might be. Eugene has a very extensive non-vehicular transportation system that consists of sidewalks. It consists of off-road multi-use paths. And that non-vehicular transportation system is mentioned and important to our climate action plan, to our local transportation system plan, as needing to be used and expanded for reducing carbon emissions within Eugene. To have a well-functioning and working and overall within our structure non-vehicular transportation system, everybody needs to be able to access it. And when everybody includes those within our community with disabilities. And for everybody to have that access, there has to be a minimum clear width on the sidewalks and on our multi-use paths. And when you have campsites that are erected that prevent that minimum width that is needed for folks with disabilities to access our non-vehicular transportation system, they are denied access to the system. So on March 8th, you will be having an opportunity to talk about a proposed code amendment that would prohibit camping in locations when the location prevents the minimum clear width necessary and set by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Federal Highway Administration that's necessary for sidewalks and off-site paths. So those are the type of, and that's a place example. Time, manner, place. That's the where example. So those are the kind of things that will be discussed and proposed, and you'll have an opportunity to talk about on the 8th. So other place regulations you'll also have an opportunity to talk about, and there will be a list kind of that we'll hoping we'll just be able to move through, and you'll get those in advance in your AIS. Another one would be some very significant safety hazards to our unhoused community when their campsites are located in areas that are reserved for or primarily used by vehicular traffic. We've seen some tragedies in other communities. So what regulations can we put in place within our community to prevent that from happening at the outset? So you're going to be focusing, your House Bill 3115 discussions are really going to focus you on the prohibited camping code provision, but I think it's a really nice opportunity for us to remind everybody and yourselves what you have done up to this point to establish permitted overnight sleeping opportunities and options and programs within this community, because you've done a lot of them. And many of them are captured in Eugene Code 4.816, which is your permitted overnight sleeping. Some of them you've adopted and they're still uncodified. They're not in our code yet. But I will say I've reviewed many code provisions that people have either other cities have very recently adopted to comply with House Bill 3115 or are in the process of considering. And they are in a much different place when it comes to thinking about and establishing permitted overnight sleeping provisions than the city of Eugene is. And what is very clear when I look at other proposed codes that people are thinking about these programs to help them get into compliance is Eugene has been groundbreaking, we've been trailblazing, and we are being copied, which is an enormous form of flattery, but you will see very similar programs of the Eugenes in other people's codes. They're showing up. For example, our vehicle camping code, you're starting to see these in other cities' code provisions as they comply with 3115. Eugene Council adopted your vehicle camping permission 25 years ago. So in 1998, when you took that action, you did very significant things. As your jumping off point to your permitted overnight sleeping provisions, you allowed for vehicular camping in public and private parking lots based on some parameters. And also with a property owner's permission, you allowed for every backyard and every driveway to be considered a permitted overnight sleeping location. And that was your jumping off point 25 years ago. Very broad. So since 1998, you've done a lot of things to expand 4.816, which is your permitted camping or permitted overnight sleeping. You expanded vehicular definition to include tents and trailers and campers, and all the programs you've adopted since then, your rest stop program, your dusk to dawn program, your safe tent sleeping, your safe parking site, all of that. These are exceptions to your prohibited camping provisions, and they are set out that way in your code. So why that matters is as other folks are getting into this and looking at this at ways to provide these alternatives, and they're starting down this path, this is a well-traveled path for Eugene. And it's important because as you are looking at your prohibited camping provisions and bringing it in line with 3115, and there will be some changes that you'll want to make and should make, the context of what you also have done since 1998 to allow for permitted overnight sleeping is appropriate to consider as you're having these discussions. And it's also a good reminder to everyone what the opportunities are in Eugene. So bringing back to getting us in line with 3115, there also is some other things that you will see in your March 8th AIS that you'll have an opportunity to talk about that have come up and have been a topic of a lot of conversation around this table. One is the public health hazard of discharging waste and sewage into our systems from RVs and other things. You'll have an opportunity to look at a code provision that just makes that really clear that that's prohibited. It is as a public safety hazard. You'll also have an opportunity, if you would like, to codify your dusk to dawn program, which also has a kind of offshoot of a dawn to dawn program. You made that permanent. You lifted the sunset back in 2017, but it still doesn't come, it's not in our code. You may want to just codify it, add it to 4.816 if you would like. So that will be the meat of the conversation. You'll have some options. What I am hoping to, I'm not going to put a bunch of code in front of you. What you'll have is all of kind of the topics. And what I am hoping that will happen out of the meeting on the 8th is that you can say, yes, go forth and draft code for these, and these, maybe not those. And then we'll be working on that when you're on break and hopefully be able to come back with a public hearing in April. So that was a lot. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Mayor.
That was a lot, but it was actually great. I hung on your every word. So thank you very much for that. And I know Randy has a comment, and then Mike, and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, City Attorney. I think you've answered a lot of my questions, but I'm hoping you come back with a little more clarity between vehicle, RV and trailer camping on our streets. I think it's clear that it's going to be prohibited for tent camping just from a safety issue alone, but I'll be interested in the RV trailer situation and what this House bill does to our ability to enforce maintaining our streets. Another area I'm interested in, and you may or may not be able to do this, I would like to know at what point does camping transition over into, and for lack of a better term, I'll call it homesteading, where you start seeing actual structures going up and more, they don't look as temporary as, somebody pitching a tent. I mean, I understand everybody has the right to sleep and I actually agree with that, but it's just at some point, and we've seen it over and over and over again, where it transitions into weeks and sometimes months in the same spot. And then another question I had on as far as the bike paths and trail system, I understand, somebody pitches a tent and there needs to be a clear space beyond that? Does that also include their possessions? Because possessions and garbage fields tend to expand out from where cover is placed.
Regarding the possessions, because of the need for this minimum width that we are finding really is an obstacle for people using our system. While the prohibited camping code provision wouldn't address that, you will be having an opportunity to consider a separate code provision that addresses these possessions that are also not allowing for this width, because however that clear width needs to be maintained, whether it's a tent or is it all their personal possessions, the lack of access is the same.
Right.
So that will be part of your options for consideration on the 8th.
Okay, good. I guess I'll look forward to hearing more about that, but I know we have worked very hard to try to find reasonable standards. We've tried to build these larger safe sleep sites. You know, we still have a number of other options that we have available. I'm really worried about backsliding and what we can keep available, and then how long we allow people to stay in one spot, because when somebody takes up a space in a park or anywhere else, they're taking that space away from others to be able to use. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mike and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, City Attorney. That was riveting for me as well. I got all of the stuff you said. I appreciated it. That there is a caveat that has always bothered me that exists in Martin v. Boise and the Medford case, and I think 3115. And that's the point I want to get more information about. I want to ask more questions about. It's the but for provision, essentially, that that says without somewhere else to go. Now, my question, first of all, is there guidance from the court? Are there standards that determine what that means? Or on what basis that's judged? If somebody's got somebody's sitting in a park next to a tent and they got a brand new case of beer sitting there that they could have spent the money somewhere else, but they didn't. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, to stay in a motel room or whatever else, how is that but for provision defined in legislation or in the case? Is it at all?
The
Who
cases
determines that?
The cases do speak to it. Johnson, the Grants Pass case, speaks to it more than the Boise case does, but they don't speak to it in terms of what I think I'm hearing from you is the personal choices of the unhoused individual.
Who determines that they have nowhere else to go?
Right. That court decision does speak to, it's an individualized determination of whether they have access to. So for example, that court decision spoke to if somebody has been, 86 from a shelter, that shelter is not available to them anymore, and it can't be considered available to them because they're not allowed to be there. So it does speak to that.
May I jump in there?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to just throw out a hypothetical, which is dangerous, I know, but let's do it anyway. Let's say someone has the ability to stay at one of the shelters that we have provided, one of the different types of options, but isn't able to unless they comply with rules they're not willing to comply with. At that time, are they able to go there or are they not able to go there?
Based on the reasoning, and I'll go back and take a specific look at that component of the Grants Pass case, but based on the reasoning in Grants Pass, that wouldn't be considered not available to them under the Grants Pass case. I mean, that their choice not to want to comply with the rules wasn't what they were talking about when it was considered whether they had access to it or not. It really was whether they used examples like if you have 20 women only beds, yeah, you have 20 beds available, but the unhoused is a gentleman. Right. So they spoke about it in terms of, things that were less within their control. So just not wanting to follow rules would not come under that rubric of not being available or not having access to it.
To me, that's the key part of our response to this issue that I don't think we've addressed appropriately. The accountability that someone has in determining if they have options. And that's something I'd like to make sure we're conscious of when we're doing this as well. So any more information you can get me on a clear definition of standards there with regard to that alternative choice is going to be important to me.
Okay.
And is there anything in code that you can think of? This is the nub of it, that speaks to an individual's responsibility to provide for their own shelter? Or is it assumed somehow in law that if someone doesn't have an easy option or a comfortable one, that they can choose not to have one and thus transfer the responsibility for their shelter to the public? Is there any law that speaks to that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Alan and then Matt.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I've heard from a lot of people that their belief that the Boise case and the Grants Pass case say that we can't prevent anybody from homeless people from sleeping on public grants anywhere, allows them to do that, which is not my interpretation of this. I think it's not yours. I hope that that becomes clearer. But you seem to be making this distinction between camping and sleeping. And to me, it almost, and these are just questions for you to ponder as you come back. To me, that's almost seems like a distinction without a difference. I mean, you can't camp without sleeping. I mean, and the way that Boise was structured, it has, sleeping, sitting, or keeping warm, which is not too dissimilar from camping. What's that distinction?
So the Boise case, the sitting sleeping line, the reason why that is significant, and there is a distinction between camping and there are cities that have laws that prohibit you from sitting, the act of sitting, the act of sleeping. We have never had those. And the reason why it is more of a distinction with a difference is because those are involuntary acts. And Boise spoke about them being involuntary acts and why punishment of an involuntary act is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. So that was significant to the decision and significant to how they reached their conclusion that the Eighth Amendment is impacted by these laws that prohibit the act of sitting, sleeping, lying. The Grants Pass case and then the 3115 that brings in the rudimentary keeping warm from the elements, that is getting, I think, Councilor Zelenka, what you're saying. Now we're talking about camping, which is why I do think we need to look at and make some revisions to your prohibited camping provision because of that addition. If this was only limited to sitting, sleeping, lying, we have no regulations about that. We do have camping provisions and they are implicated by the decisions now.
Yeah, the sleeping and keeping warm part is the part that seems like, I don't know how that's different from camping, but it doesn't seem, it's difficult for me to make that distinction. My other questions are same lines as what Mike was talking about, which is, the no alternative sleeping space is available. So if there's one bed available in our system, or we have car camping spaces, or there are backyards available, or we have all these other options that we have, safe sleeping spaces and dusk to dawn centers. And so if there's an availability in any of those, does that count? And then the obvious question is, what if he says, I don't want to go there? That's the question Mike asked, which is the same one I had, which is, well, you can't stay here.
So the interesting piece of the overlay of House Bill 3115 is it doesn't have what Councilor Clark described as a caveat, and that what we've talked about in the cases. What I read was a city or county, any city or county law that regulates the act of sitting and sleeping or lying, there is no piece that says unless they have somewhere to go. So what we are looking at, it makes it simpler, I think, for purposes of just analyzing your code provisions and what changes we want to make, because it doesn't have that introductory piece to it. Our prohibited camping provisions need to be reasonable time, place, and manner regulations. And so that's what we'll be aiming for.
As opposed to the no option bill,
Mhm.
because the math doesn't work. We have more homeless people than we have spots.
And House Bill 3115 just doesn't make that distinction. I know folks have said it's just a codification of those two cases and they presume that kind of caveat's there, but the words aren't there. So we're gonna approach it from a reasonable time, place, and
Are
manner.
you gonna bring back specific language for us to look at?
I can do that. It starts to get a little, edited.
I'm not sure where this is headed.
So what you'll have in front of you, what you'll have in front of you are lists of ways in which you can address this that would be code amendments but you'd be able to identify them. I think it will be easier for you to talk about them that way. So for example, the one I gave as an example of having clear widths that comply with the American Disabilities Act, that would be an option for you if you want to include that as a prohibition on where people can camp. Instead of actually having the code language, it will just describe what that code language would be. So, but you'll have a list to make it hopefully easier to move through.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, do I have anyone else in the queue?
Interest
No.
in time.
Thank-
I'll wait I'm really interested to see, Mayor, what the recommendations are before I just.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful. And I think we're all eager to hear what you have to say on March 8th and to see that list. And so with that, thank you all very much. We are adjourned.